Good morning, everybody. I'm Mark and I'm an addict. I'm your former WSC co-facilitator, or WSC former co-facilitator. And I've been asked to do a presentation on WSC processes. One of the things that we have to remember is that the WSC processes are still evolving. So who participates? Who is a conference participant? The conference participants are a World Board. The conference is facilitated by the World Board Chair. There's two co-facilitators. They facilitate the business sessions of the WSC and discussion sessions. And the Human Resource Panel coordinates the election process. And then, of course, the most important members are the zonal and regional delegates and their alternates. An integral part of the conference is NA's staff, without whom it would be almost impossible to conduct a WSC live or virtually. What is the conference? As defined in GWSNA, it's the nerve center of our fellowship. It used to be defined in GWSNA as an event. That's changed, and we changed the wording, and today it's an entity and an event. It is where all of our world services come together to exchange ideas and have discussions. Questions of significance to the Fellowship of Narcotics Anonymous as a whole are discussed. And the conference works to fulfill the WSC mission statement. That's the conference in a nutshell. When and where? The event used to take place biennially. It was held typically the last week of April in Chatsworth. The Guide to World Services defines it to be held within 75 miles of the World Service Office. So up until 2018, that's what we did. We met in person. The end of April, the week at the end of April was the week of the conference. COVID-19 changed all of that. Now it's become multiple weekends. What will it look like in the future? We really don't know. I will say this, this year in March, the first week of March, Daniel and I were in California meeting with the World Board and NA's staff, and that was the culmination of our preparation efforts. And that's kind of when COVID was starting to become an issue. And the day after we left, California was shut down. So then we had to start preparations for what we were going to do for the conference. And it seemed to be the only possibility was a virtual conference, and no one had any experience with it. So from that point forward, it became an evolving process. No one really knew how it was going to work, if it was going to work, and what it was going to look like. So this is the how of the World Service Conference. What happens? Well, we have fellowship development discussions, public relations presentations, large group discussions with the entire body, small group discussions where we break out into separate rooms, typically a couple for RDs, a couple for ADs, and then a Spanish-speaking room. There are presentations given, elections and reports, and decision-making. The decision-making part of the conference is kind of the meat of the conference. All the other items I just mentioned are really the preparation or the recipe, if you will, that makes that meat tender and tasty. So it requires a lot of focus. It requires everyone to pay attention, especially in the group discussions, small or large. So then we want to talk about the decision-making sessions. There are two decision-making sessions, car-related discussions, and then the CAT discussions and decisions. Car-related discussions and decisions are motions and amendments, including the processes to be used, the approval of the previous WSC minutes, conference agenda report motions, and amendments to CAR motions. Typically, we start the session with processes to be used during the current WSC, which were agreed upon in the previous WSC, where we typically have experimented with different processes. This is the place where trust, honesty, goodwill, open-mindedness, anonymity, all of those principles need to come together here in these decision-making discussions. The CAT-related discussion and decisions include the NAW's budget, project plans, decisions on seating requests, World Board motions included in the CAT, and amendments to all of the above if there are any. Quite a number of challenges were born with virtual WSC. We really had no idea how to deal with amendments. What were the important parts of the WSC that we were going to deal with? We had no idea how long it was going to take. Typically, consensus-based decision-making takes longer anyway because it is discussion-based, which I know Lewis will touch on in the next session. Okay, so now we're going to move to the nuts and bolts of the processes, which is what I'm sure you're all here for. So consensus-based decision-making, real quickly, the Latin cum sentire is come together or think together, feel together. It's a creative process, bringing ideas together from all over the world, our worldwide fellowship. It is definitely more time-consuming, as I stated earlier, and it requires the respect of all involved because not all the decisions are unanimous. It's a manifestation of the statement, what we cannot do alone, we can do together. And it's a manifestation of the ninth concept, where we carefully consider all viewpoints. The goal is to find common ground and efficiently and effectively move on. Differs from Robert's rules, where you could have 51% happy and 49% really pissed off. In consensus-based decision, we try to move those numbers both ways. We try and get more people in agreement and less people pissed off. Never is everyone happy. That's the main thing. And that's where the open-mindedness and compromise come in. So for those who are visually based, this is a flow chart of how the process works. Sometimes visual works for me, sometimes it doesn't. I don't want to get bogged down in the flow chart, but these are available to you in the resources which will be mentioned at the end of the presentation. Those of you who are less visually oriented and more word oriented, you have a little different flow chart that pretty much tells you the same thing. So with that, I'm going to get into the nuts and bolts of how it works and what the decision-making process actually looks like, because it can be confusing, especially if you've never experienced it before. So the first thing we want to talk about is quorum. There is a quorum in consensus-based decision-making, and it's defined as the number of members required to conduct business. Quorum today at the WSC is defined as a majority of all eligible voting members. Who are eligible voting members? Well, we have regional delegates, 1 vote for each region. We have the World Board members in the CAT decision-making process. They do not vote in the CAR process. And now we have zonal delegates. So if there's a zone with 2 or more unseated regions, they can send a zonal delegate with all of the same duties and responsibilities as a regional delegate. So first, the motion is introduced or read by the facilitator. What used to happen in 2018 is that then the World Board would provide their response after the maker provided an explanation of the motion. Between 2018 and 2020, even before COVID, we decided that it was a little bit of a waste of time to hear the maker and to hear the World Board response, because those items are published in the conference agenda report. And presumably everyone can read, and those who can't may have somebody who can read it to them. The motions are all published in the conference agenda report, and it was felt that there was ample time to read the motion, understand the motion, read the World Board response, and then begin their discussions. So we eliminated that extra time to explain the motion, and now it is just read by the facilitator, at which point an initial straw poll is taken. So in the world of electronic voting, this becomes a very quick process. In 2018, we experimented with electronic voting and it worked really well. So a straw poll is a measure of where the body stands on a particular issue, an informal pulse, if you will. Amendments and motions are straw polled frequently or as the facilitator decides. And I want to back up a little bit. This evolution of the WSC probably has been going on for 20 years. And as we moved away from Robert's rules and into consensus-based decision-making, each conference brought new procedures, which made it a little bit difficult for new people to understand and for those who have experience to feel comfortable. So if we keep changing the rules, you have to provide a lot of focus and understanding before you get there. It requires a lot of preparation. And in my experience from 2010 moving forward, the facilitators have a difficult job in that if they're not trusted or if they don't have a level of confidence in what they're doing, then the body has less confidence in the facilitators. So for the facilitators, it's equally difficult when the rules change because there's not a lot of time to prepare for those changes. I know in my experience as a facilitator, it was incumbent upon me to learn the new rules very quickly, while a regional delegate or a zonal delegate can participate and has all this time, this 2-year period to become familiar with the process, which I would say some of them do, some of them don't. The facilitators are presented, especially a first-time facilitator. I'll go back to 2018. When I was a first-time facilitator, I didn't know what the process was other than experiencing it as an RD. When you stand at that podium, it's a very different experience. The rules become real important. And I have to know them well enough so that you trust me that what I'm doing is the right thing. And for the most part, that happens. There are some hiccups along the way. But in 2016, and I go back to that conference, which some of you here I know experienced, my opinion, I was sitting in the gallery in 2016, and it was a total disaster. And I know many delegates felt the same way. And some of the causes of that were that probably from 2014 to 2016, the most changes took place in the process. And what happened in 2016 is that the facilitators had a brand new process in front of them. There were not a lot of new rules and new processes they were unfamiliar with. And there was a lot of stuttering going on when it came time to say what to do next. And consequently, the body started to mistrust the decisions of the facilitators. And 2016 was also the time where your yellow cards were taken away. Yellow cards were if you had a question on process. Well, those yellow cards were flying in 2016. And nobody was really comfortable with the process. And it really took a long time, and it was, I think it was a disaster. So anyway, from 16 to 18, we removed the yellow cards. There was less of a chance to question the process, and it was incumbent upon every participant to prepare in knowing the process before you get there. So moving on, a vote happens when the body makes a decision on an item. A straw poll is not a decision. A straw poll is simply a measure of where the body stands on a particular issue, and it's a tool for the facilitator to gauge how they're going to make their next decision. In consensus-based decision-making, facilitators have a lot of discretion, and that's to some people's chagrin, and it seems arbitrary at times. However, I know my experience in having facilitated an in-person meeting and facilitated a virtual WSC, very different experiences, and the level of difficulty moving from in-person to virtual was really exponential. Some of the tools that a facilitator uses in person is they read body language. We can read many people's faces. We can read confusion. We can read objection. We can read frustration. And you lose a lot of that in a virtual WSC because you can only see, first of all, 49 participants on the screen. Not everybody has a camera on. And you lose that ability to read the audience. So straw polls, again, they give us a sense, the facilitators, a sense of where the body is on a particular issue. So in a straw poll, you have the following: unanimous consent, which is rare, 100% support. And I think the only time I experienced unanimous support at a WSC, virtual or otherwise, was with our literature. And even then, there were times where it was not unanimous. You have consensus support, and this is where we start getting into the numbers. Consensus support is defined as 80% of participating voting members. And just keep that in the back of your mind because we'll talk about that later. Strong support, 2/3 majority, so 66.67%. to 79.99%. So if it falls in that category, it's strong support. And mind you that our Guide to World Service requires a 2/3 majority to pass any motion. Then you have support, which is kind of falls in the middle of everything. Simple majority is greater than 50%, but less than 2/3. Lack of support is that middle ground, again, less than simple majority, 33 1/3 to 50%. Strong lack of support is less than 1/3. Greater than 20% and less than 33 1/3%. And you might ask, well, why are the numbers so particular? Well, the numbers that mean the most is the greater than 80% or less than 20%, and that'll become clear in a minute. Consensus not in support is 20% or fewer, so greater than 0 or less than 20%. And then, of course, if nobody supports the motion, it's unanimous, no support. And if you have questions, I will leave time to field questions when I'm through. So as we continue, each participant has one vote. An RD or a zonal delegate can give their AD the right to speak. Another tool for the facilitator: no member speaks more than once. There's a behind the scenes facilitation thing going on where we kind of award the golden mic to people at the end of the conference, and that goes to the people who raised their hand the most or spoke the most, and kind of sometimes take over a discussion. And a lot of times that happens because somebody says something and then a new idea comes up in the person who just spoke's mind, or they want to rebut what was just said. In any case, the facilitators now have the discretion to not allow a member to speak more than once. Each member has 2 minutes to speak. This requires that the speaker get to the point. And as we did in the last 2 WSCs, the facilitators reminded people that if you have something to say, please make sure that it's a new idea or something that hasn't already been said. And saying the same thing in your voice doesn't mean it's different. And then the facilitators also have the ability and the discretion to give more time to each person if it's needed. If it's a complex idea and 2 minutes is not enough, we can give them more time, again, up to the discretion of the facilitator, which some people feel is too objective. Those who have English as a second language are usually given some leeway, as it's sometimes difficult to think and translate at the same time. If you speak a foreign language as a first language, you're thinking in that language, and then you're trying to speak in English. It's very difficult. So here we go into the numbers. So I read the motion as the facilitator. And then we take a straw poll and we ask you to vote. And I'll get into the ways to vote in a moment. So if the body has 80% or greater support, the facilitators will then ask 2 people from the minority to speak about why they're opposed. If we feel there are valid points, we being the facilitators, and that maybe someone else saying something additionally to the same point, we can continue the debate. But typically, if the initial straw poll is 80% or greater, the discussion is limited to only 2 from the minority. Then you, as the body, can decide whether or not to hear amendments to the motion if there is consensus. So if it's 80% or better, you can decide whether to hear an amendment or not. So if you have 80% consensus in the initial straw poll, and Kelly raises his hand and says, I have an amendment to the motion, now the facilitators will ask the body if they want to hear the amendment. And the reason for that is that we have spent inordinate amounts of time discussing amendments when the initial straw poll was 80% or greater, and then consequent straw polls and the vote remain the same. So now the body gets to decide whether they want to hear that amendment or not. At that point, a second straw poll is taken. And I'm going to read a chat because, okay. Yes, I'm going to answer that question, and I'm going to ask you to hold your questions if you can with the chat, because one of the things that happens virtually for a facilitator is that they're looking in 2 different, 3 different, 4 different directions sometimes, and the chat box becomes a distraction. So hold on to your questions. But that question simply was, can anyone make an amendment? Yes, if you're an eligible voter at the conference, you can offer an amendment. At that point, a second straw poll is taken, and that's if we had reached 80% in the initial and no amendments are being heard. A second straw poll is taken. If consensus remains greater than 80%, and that is considered a final decision, and we move on to the next motion. If you do introduce a motion or an amendment within the session, which we are trying to eliminate that process. We're trying to make amendments, which we tried at this WSC 2020. We're providing a deadline for amendments so that we don't have on the floor, on the fly amendments. It has to have a second. Once an amendment is presented and seconded, the motion belongs to the conference, and we must deal with the amendment in some matter before we go back to the main motion. And I'm sure there are going to be questions about this process, so I will try and get to the, I'm stuck for some reason. Okay, so amendments and motions. The facilitators also have discretion to offer compromises when amendments are tying up the body. So if we have an amendment and the discussion seems to be going on and on and on, and we're not getting anywhere, if the facilitator has a suggestion of a compromise, they can offer that. They're not voting on it, they're just offering a compromise in hopes to move the body in one direction or another. If the amendment receives 2/3 support, 66.67% or greater by the body, the replacement motion or the amendment is accepted. And then we go back to the main motion. 2/3 majority present and voting in the affirmative is required to pass a motion. So now we go to that, that important segment of greater than 20% or less than 80%. So after the initial straw poll, if the outcome falls between 20 and 80%, then discussion is started on the motion. The facilitators will start a queue. In other words, you will start to raise your hands. The order of the queue is decided by the facilitators, not who raises their hand first. This created a lot of controversy in our virtual WSC, because what happens is in the participant screen, what shows is the order of the people who raise their hands. So as you raise your hand, you're moved to the next position. But if we want to have a diverse input into any motion, the facilitators need the discretion to call on the people who may not speak all the time, or from those countries that speak very little at all on anything. So the order is decided by the facilitators. It is not arbitrary. We keep track of those who have spoken before, how many times they've spoken, whether they've spoken on this motion before or not. And what we're looking for is to get that diversity of opinion. Each participant can speak once per motion. And that's important because once you speak, it's important to hear others. And if you're looking to speak again, for instance, with this virtual WSC, the number of people who raised their hand to speak on each motion was probably 2 to 3 times of the number of people that actually raised their hand when we met in person. And I found that to be kind of interesting in that there seemed to be, and you know, I hope nobody takes this personal, there seemed to be more courage speaking from a keyboard as opposed to speaking in person in front of 200 people. There might be a lot of reasons for that, which I don't know. The facilitators can take a straw poll at any given time. They can take frequent straw polls if needed. So if 2 or 3 or 4 people speak and we feel, the facilitators, we feel that the body may have moved because of what was said, we can take another straw poll, and it gives us a sense if the body's moving or not. So we might see a move from 50 to 58%. And then we'll go ahead and open discussion again. 4 or 5 more people speak. We take another straw poll, and all of a sudden we're at 63%. We'll continue that discussion because it's moving in a direction that's obvious. Some people think that's somewhat arbitrary by the facilitators, but there's a method to challenge that. So once we see that the debate is not moving any further, we can close the queue. We can end the debate. So there might be 3, 4 people left in the queue, and we're going to say, okay, after this person, the queue is closed, and we're going to move to a vote. We will ask the body if everyone is ready to vote. At this time, this is in place of the yellow cards. You can ask a question about the process or ask for information that will help you make a decision. It is not the time for additional debate. This was very confusing to some for some reason. It's a question about the process. If you have an objection to closing the debate and you do not agree with the decision, you can challenge or appeal the decision of the co-facilitator. At that point, you will have 2 minutes to explain why you think the debate should continue, and then the co-facilitator will have 2 minutes to explain why they closed the queue. 9 times out of 10, the co-facilitator will use mathematics, and at least this facilitator does. And if I see a pattern developing or not developing, that will be my reason for closing the debate. Oftentimes, the debate is asked to be continued just because they haven't spoken yet, because the member hasn't had a chance to express their opinion. However, this is where the co-facilitators, again, have discretion. And it's very difficult standing in that position to say, no, you can't speak. But if we're looking at the common welfare of the 200 people sitting in the room, and we as the co-facilitators believe that the body's not going to move whether someone speaks again or not, then that's what our decision is. We close that debate and we move on in the interest of the whole. So if you've challenged or appealed the decision of the co-facilitator, after the co-facilitator has spoken, we will take a vote to uphold the co-facilitator's decision to close the debate. So if you're voting yes, you're voting to uphold the decision to close debate. That was a little confusing, and it is very clear in our Guide to World Service. And I believe there was a point in our Part 1 WSC 2020 where we actually made an error. Daniel and I made a mistake, and we were asking for the opposite, which made it extremely confusing. 2/3 of those present and voting have to vote in favor of the co-facilitators for the decision to stand. If we get 2/3 in favor of the co-facilitator's decision to close the debate, then the vote takes place on the motion. Here are our voting options. You can vote yes, you can vote no, you can still abstain, and you can choose present, not voting. And in WSC 2020 Part 2, we added a new option where we send the vote home with you. So you vote by e-poll after the close of the sessions. The motion is emailed to each delegate. They're given a deadline to cast their vote, and the votes are calculated electronically by your responses. And I said that we still have abstentions, and that will become clear shortly. There's discussion about removing that option. So here's the difference: present, not voting, and abstentions. You have a choice to not participate in the vote. That's present, not voting. What that means is you're taking yourself out of the total vote count. You will not be counted in the total number of votes for that motion. So if we started out with 125 and we had 5 people who cast a present, not voting ballot, the total now goes down to 120. This is different from an abstention. Abstentions impact the outcome because they're included in the total. And they're actually included in the total as not in support of the motion. And that might become clear in the chart that's about to go up. So here's an example, as a mathematical example. You have 60 people in the room. First, 40 vote yes and 20 vote no. 40 is 2/3 of 60, the motion passes. If you have 38 yes, 19 no, and 3 abstentions, you still have 60 people because the abstentions are counted as part of the total. However, what happens is you only have 38 in favor, so the motion fails. It is not 2/3 of 60, it's less than that. And then the third possibility is that you have 38 who vote yes, like in the previous example, 19 that vote no, like in the previous example. You have no abstentions, but you have 3 people who voted present, not voting. You remove those 3 from the total vote count. Now you only have 57 people in the total vote count. 38 yes is 2/3 of 57. Now the motion passes because you have greater than 2/3. So that's, I hope that makes it really clear how present, not voting, or abstentions impact the vote. Abstentions can impact the outcome. There's discussions about whether we should remove abstentions completely, because if you remember Robert's Rules of Order, an abstention is that you don't have enough information to vote. There's an opportunity to ask for that information before you cast your vote in this process. And we would hope that anyone without information asks the question and then can make a decision, yes, no, or present, not voting. So there's a real discussion on whether we need to remove abstentions from the process. There's a lot of resources, and I know I've talked for, I guess it's, how long have I talked? 40 minutes, 35 minutes. That's a synopsis of the process. I hope there are questions. It's an evolving process. Virtual WSC 2020 put a monkey wrench in the smooth process that happened in 2018. So we're kind of starting all over again in figuring out what to do, how to do it, when to do it. WSC 2020 took place over the course of, I think it was 3 or 4 weekends. Sitting behind a computer screen for 2-hour sessions, for 3 sessions in a day, is extremely difficult. As an RD, you're watching a screen in front of you. As a co-facilitator and staff member, you're watching at least 4 screens. And you have NAWS staff feeding you information at the same time. very different from a physical WSC. And I would ask that everybody moving forward have a lot of patience with Daniel and Mario. Mario, Daniel, and myself and NAWS staff are continuing our discussions. We are continuing our discussions about the processes and how to conduct a virtual WSC 2022, if indeed that's what happens. Right now, that's what it's looking like. So there's some resources up here on the screen, and I think at this point, I want to open it to questions. Hopefully there are some.